Vivek Ramaswamy has addressed the LGBT issue and done so with class and style. This is honestly one of the most succinct ways I've heard people explain this and talk to someone who would come from the more progressive wing of thought. This is genuinely a heartfelt way to explain this, to convey this message to people who are completely removed from the perspective of what I would say is the average individual who doesn't believe that you have the right to demand what someone say and do simply because you yourself would get offended. Vivek handles this with absolute class, extending the olive branch while also completely collapsing on all of the facets of the problems that come with this authoritarian perspective that people try and do when they tell you you can't say and do certain things solely because of who it may or may not offend. Let's go ahead and get into this. This is honestly genuinely incredibly well done. Let's go. Once again, Vivek Ramaswamy handles one of the most tenuous questions of our age, the nuclear question. What we call in the business the thing that will sink your entire campaign. And the thing that's so crazy about this is that unlike any other person in the political class, Vivek handles this with delicacy and nuance. Unlike so many, because I would argue so many don't have the capacity because their ideological blinders are so thick that they are completely removed from the capacity to talk about these things outside of their own school of thought that they are regimented to think in, because what they've had happen to them effectively is that they've had their spectrum of thought curated by the current culture, and with that comes the nature of people not wanting to talk about certain no-no topics. But Vivek never ever afraid to talk about things like this. Let's go ahead and get into it. He handles this with genuine class. I cannot get over the fact of how amazing he is when he talks about things like this, because this is the level of oration that we need to be able to convey the things to people who are effectively so far gone politically that they do not care to listen to anyone outside of their own perspective, because anything outside of what they consider to be the moral class or the people who are on the right side of history simply isn't worth listening to, because they see you as quite literally their enemy. Let's go ahead and see what Vivek has to say.
I was just wondering, what were your opinions on the LGBTQ plus community?
Well, I don't think it's one community.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, how could it be? Just mash together an alphabet soup. Trans is fundamentally in tension with gay, if you ask me. But what's your opinion?
Handled perfectly. He asked the question after completely breaking down the structure of why he thinks what he thinks, and he starts off with a beautiful insight that many people don't understand, that if you want to attack the left, you attack the left from the left. If you want to attack the right, you will attack the right from the right. And the reason you would do something like this is because it's a far more concise and precise attack if you're going to be attacking people from their own school of thought, because the criticism seems to be far more valid. So this is a major thing that people in politics need to understand, and Vivek, being someone who's post-libertarian, I would argue very much understands this. Let's go ahead and get into the fact that he handles this, and I cannot get over this, beautifully. If politicians knew how to approach the prospect of dealing with people who can turn a subject like this into an incredibly toxic bomb that will effectively smoke out your entire campaign and have to make you run for the hills to leave your political ambitions astray, well, you might be someone that people should listen to.
I'm personally pansexual, so I was
Okay.
just wondering what your views on same-sex couples were.
I don't have a negative view of same-sex couples, but I do have a negative view of a tyranny of the minority. So I think that in the name of protecting against a tyranny of the majority, and there are times in this country's history where we have had a tyranny of the majority, we have now, in the name of protecting against tyranny of the majority, created a new tyranny of the minority. And I think that that's wrong. I don't think that somebody who's religious should be forced to officiate a wedding that they disagree with. I don't think somebody who is a woman who's worked really hard for her achievements should be forced to compete against a biological man in a swim competition. I don't think that somebody who's a woman that respects her bodily autonomy and dignity should be forced to change clothes in a locker room with a man. That's not freedom, that's oppression. And so I believe that we live in a country where free adults should be free to dress how they want, behave how they want, and that's fine. But you don't become oppressive by foisting that on others. And that especially includes kids, because kids aren't the same as adults. And so I think adults are free to make whatever choices they want, but do not foist that ideology onto children before children are in a position as adults to make decisions for themselves. And so I think a lot of the frustration in the country, and if I'm being really honest, that I also share, comes from that new culture of oppression where saying those things can actually get somebody punished. And in my case, it's part of why it's my responsibility to say them. And I respect that you may have a different opinion.
Oh my goodness. If there was anyone in politics outside of Barack Obama that had this capacity to reach over to the other side and speak with genuine care, and again, I say this in the sense that Barack Obama was a genuine speaker, not a genuine person. He was still a political candidate and nothing more. He was just a junior senator that got into office that was completely over his head, that was co-opted and effectively became nothing more than a puppet for the lobbying class. Vivek is so good at extending the olive branch that it's honestly unbelievable. The fact that he talks about the fact of all the subtle nuances of how this applies to the multiple different facets of his life, as well as the structures around family, as well as how this will tie into the market with the threat of people losing their jobs because they can't simply speak because of the tyranny of the minority, with the fact that we are now bending the structure of society around a small group of people who wield a large amount of power because en masse they are such a vocal, prominent portion online, and because we now live as online creatures because the nature of the public square has shifted into online discourse because of how much the internet has inculcated itself within us and vice versa, what we see is effectively people have to tread on eggshells, and they walk on eggshells with fear of losing things like their job. And it's one reason that people are so in the closet when it comes to the nature of their politics many times, whether left or right. Although many of the people on the left, I would argue, feel far safer when it comes to the nature of expressing their politics. Let's go ahead and let Vivek finish.
And that's okay. Part of what makes our country great is that you and I can be civil and have this conversation, and that we live in a country that still gives us, each of us, the right to speak to a presidential candidate and back, and still say that we pledge allegiance to the same nation. So I think that's the beauty of our country, and that's my honest opinion.
Awesome. Well,
Thanks.
thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Thank you for your civility as well. I appreciate it.
So, the nature that he comments on something so valuable, that is a huge thing, because he knew this clip is going to go viral. He knew it's going to go everywhere because it's, again, the nuclear question. He says, thank you for your civility as well. Because many of the times the people that are pushing this agenda, let's be honest, they are not acting civil when it comes to the nature of how they purport their activism. And because of it, it makes them incredibly difficult to deal with. But in the process of showing and commenting on the nature of the civility of the individual, you are then highlighting the capacity of how you would highlight these issues in a glorified manner rather than a demonized one to the people who would then see this as something rather than to hate, something to understand. And that is major. I cannot emphasize that enough. Let's go ahead and get into this article from the Post Millennial. Got another clip from Vivek. Let's go. From the Post Millennial, we have Must Watch, Vivek schools pansexual reporter on tyranny of the LGBT minority. And he does school her with class and grace, but the thing is, it's very apparent that the Post Millennial is staunchly right-wing with the nature of how they wrote the title of this article. Absolutely schooled. It reminds me of the stuff of Ben Shapiro back in the day. It's like, you got owned with facts and logic. Liberal tears and all this other ridiculous rhetoric that realistically is used because it's specifically proper to incite the cultural conversation, and it's really good for the gotcha moments. But what it isn't good for is properly understanding the nature of how we have to handle these conversations, and that is something that Vivek is so good at, is handling the delicacy of which these conversations really have to be tackled, and that is with a layer of nuance that so many people miss. Okay, let's get into it. Presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy was cornered by a pansexual reporter at the Iowa State Fair who asked about his opinions on the LGBTQ community and his thoughts on same-sex couples. His response that he was not interested in allowing the tyranny of the minority. So, what's so cool about this is Vivek talking about the nature of something that, again, this comes from the thought and understanding of post-libertarian understanding, that the tyranny of the minority can exist both in cultural standards or it can exist within something like the market. And how it can exist within something like the market would be the process of how it can be co-opted by what you would call effectively bad actors. And how bad actors can co-opt things through the market many of the times would be through pushing regulation by buying off lobbyists within the government. And then doing so, they push regulations that assist them, which helps with top-down control, that then assists in their capacity to be the tyranny of the minority because they have top-down totalitarian control over the market, which is effectively how you end up getting monopolies in many cases, because they're not simply monopolies that are created through the market, they're monopolies that are government enforced because of regulation that is put on the industries. Okay. So moving on, it says the Iowa State Fair is long held the stopping point for presidential candidates in the primary election, as Iowa is the first state in the primary vote. It gives them the opportunity to interact with the voters leading up to the primary. When the pansexual reporter asked Vivek Ramaswamy about his thoughts on the LGBTQ community, he responded by saying that he doesn't think it's one community. Trans is fundamentally in tension with gay, if you ask me. Ramaswamy added, what's your opinion? Okay, so we've already watched that clip. Let's go ahead and jump into this clip from Timcast. And Vivek's entire presentation on Timcast was genuinely incredible. Seamus was hosting the episode. Tim was not there. I believe he was really sick. But one thing that's really good, and something Tim Pool has done incredibly well, is the nature and structure of Timcast, because I believe that the value of the entity itself, which would be the business of Tim Pool's LLC or Timcast itself, Timcast IRL, being his live show, I didn't think it would hold the same value without the nature of Tim being the person presenting the information, solely because the nature of his business is tied solely to his name and his understanding of who he is. When you think of Timcast IRL, you think of Tim Pool wearing a beanie and talking over people. But the thing is, he's created such an incredible structure for honest breakdowns of news with so many different varying opinions, many of the times more so leaning to the right, but that's because many of the people that lean to the left will not accept the open invitation to join him on his show. Unlike people from Lance from the Surfs, which I disagree with Lance plenty, and Lance made a fool of himself many a times on Tim's show. But nonetheless, I really give kudos to Lance because he went there to have the conversations and defend his points, even though I would argue he was using nothing more than Twitter debate bro tactics, which really didn't fend himself very well to try and bolster his points to sell anyone on his arguments. But again, he went into the lion's den to have the conversation, and that is something that should be commended in itself, and it should be appreciated that the Surfs were willing to effectively go in and have this conversation. Okay, let's go ahead and jump into Vivek.
I actually think there's a lot to that, because in a certain sense, the thing that separates us from animals is our ability to believe in something bigger than ourselves. Animals, as best we know, or non-human animals, don't have that same ability to have faith.
Yes.
And so the fact that that's essential to our humanity, also the flip side of that makes it something that we really badly need to fulfill.
Yes.
So long as we are actually fully human beings. And if we're not going to fill it with the real thing, we're going to fill it with something else. And so my definition of a cult is, it's in many ways a religion that has not withstood the test of time. And I think that we have the rise of these different secular cults in America that have oddly arisen at the same time in our national history.
Yep.
Right? You think it's a coincidence that we bow to the god of climate, as you said. I like the way you put it, worshiping or sort of sensing changes in weather patterns as something that we have to use as an atonement for our sins. It's an interesting question. It's a separate question of, do you see that at the same time that your identity is based on your race, your gender, and your sexuality, and that you're on some intersectional pyramid, higher or lower based on the combination of those attributes you inherit on the day you're born? Or a religion that says the sex of the person you're attracted to is hardwired on the day you're born, at the same time that you have to believe that your own biological sex is completely fluid over your life. I bring that up because what is a faith-based system or a religious system? It's a system where you could espouse otherwise illogical beliefs, right? Logic and reason could not lead you to these beliefs, but it has to be a different way of believing them. That's what we as a human being have a need for. We have a need to have beliefs that defy logic. And so if it's not going to be grounded in belief in a traditional religion, belief in God, even belief in a nation, a commitment to a nation is not something that flows out of logic, flows out of something that we as human beings have a desire for, have a need for, something bigger than ourselves. We're going to channel that impulse to something else. But the problem, and this is the danger of it, is not that it's not the time-tested faiths. It's the fact that we then trick ourselves into thinking that it isn't faith at all, right? Because when you go to church, you know what you're doing, right? You go to a temple, you know what you're doing. You're praying to God. You're exercising a side of your brain that's different than that which you're exercising if you're pouring chemicals in a lab and measuring things. But I think what's happened is, in absence of traditional faith and traditional beliefs, where we recognize that we're exercising our faith to believe in these things, we see the rise of new secular religions, secular cults instead, which we fail to recognize are actually religious belief systems.
Exactly.
Like the climate belief system. And I think the most dangerous religions are the ones that we fail to recognize as religions in the first place and delude ourselves into thinking that it's actually logic or reason that led us there.
Exactly.
And that's exactly what's happening in the country today.
Well,
perfect. You could not explain this any better than he just did, and he's tapping into something that's honestly a dangerous conversation when it comes to the prospect of talking about the nature of the LGBTQ community or talking about the climate change agenda, because what you're tapping into is the ideal that because people lack purpose and they don't have a rigid structure that provides them something that they can effectively align their moral compass along. And what this goes with is a conversation that Nietzsche had with himself and that he ended up writing, and this is a quote from Nietzsche, and it says that God is dead and we have killed him. And this wasn't a proclamation of success. Nietzsche wasn't necessarily an atheist, but the thing that came from this was his understanding that if you live in a society that's fundamentally based off the orientation of God and how the love of God has created the free will that mandates the orientation of how you operate in society. And this is what happens with how we have the Bill of Rights, because if our society fundamentally in the United States is built off of the Judeo-Christian moral ethic, and in the process of abandoning religion, we abandon the fundamentals of the Judeo-Christian moral ethic, where does that leave us? And that's the question that Nietzsche asked when he said, God is dead, we have killed him, and where will this leave us? This is a huge thing that's tapping into the nature of why so many people are looking for purpose in activism, because through the prospect of looking for something to carry, which would be the effect of the myth of Sisyphus, they're looking for a weight to carry up the hill, something burdenful that gives them a purpose, that lets them know that the troubles and tribulations that they suffer through on a daily basis are all worth it in the end, because there's a fight that's worth having. And this is the nature of where we have to reconjure our understanding of the purpose that makes the fight worth having. We have to reorient our understanding of how to find that purpose. And that's because the technological age has skewed our understanding of how to find it. I'm not entirely sure on how to actually search properly for this, but I know the nature of a people who are lost, and that is exactly what we are as a nation. And this is something Vivek taps into perfectly when he talks about the fact that what we're having is a national identity crisis. That's all I've got for now. This was an honestly great presentation from Vivek Ramaswamy. Once again, I can't wait to see where this goes for him. He's going to be a force in the political landscape for a long time to come, with a relevant name who's talked about for many years. That's all I've got. Give this a thumbs up if you liked it, a thumbs down if you didn't. Tell me where I'm wrong in the comment section down below. I'd love to get some critique and tell me so I can check my biases, because that's the last thing I want to do is lie to people. And I will honestly be completely okay with being wrong about something if I was honestly wrong, because I will never not lie. I will never lie about the nature of what I'm trying to do with this and trying to search for information, because truth and honesty is always the outcome that I search for, and that is always the end goal for me. So thank you for watching this. I really appreciate it. Thumbs up if you liked it. Thumbs down if you didn't. Tell me where I'm wrong in the comment section down below. Stay lovely. Stay great. Peace out.